Madrid, Spain, early 1990s, before the case had a name, before police reports and investigators, before journalists and skeptics began arguing over what was real and what wasn't. There was just a teenage girl sitting in a classroom, bored, restless, and curious. Her name was Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro. She was 14 years old, and like many teenagers, she was fascinated by the unknown. The school was ordinary, a Catholic secondary school in Vallecas, a working-class district of Madrid. The classrooms were old, the walls thin, the floors scuffed by decades of students who passed through and were forgotten. Nothing about the building suggested danger, let alone the beginning of one of Spain's most disturbing cases. But one afternoon during a free period, Estefanía and a group of her classmates decided to do something they had heard about in whispers and rumors. They decided to play with a Ouija board. There was no dramatic setup, no candles, no dark basement, just a sheet of paper, letters written in a rough circle, and a makeshift pointer. It was childish, almost laughable, something meant to pass time, to feel rebellious, to flirt with fear without believing in it. At first, nothing happened. The girls laughed, joked, mocked the idea that anything supernatural could respond to them. But then the pointer began to move, slowly, deliberately, spelling out something none of them expected, a name, a figure, a presence. According to witnesses, the atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. The temperature dropped. One of the girls claimed she felt dizzy. Another said her ears rang as if pressure had suddenly filled the room. Estefanía became pale. Her breathing became shallow. Then the classroom door burst open. A teacher had entered. What happened next would later be documented in school records and repeated by witnesses for years. The teacher saw the board and immediately grabbed it, furious. She tore it apart and threw it into a nearby trash bin. In her panic and anger, she knocked over a burner used in science experiments. The flame flared. The Ouija board caught fire. Smoke filled the room, and Estefanía screamed. She collapsed. Not fainted, collapsed. Her body convulsed violently, as if she were having a seizure. Her eyes rolled back. Her fingers clawed at the floor. She gasped for air but couldn't breathe properly. Teachers rushed in. Students ran screaming into the hallways. An ambulance was called. The incident was written off as a medical emergency, but Estefanía would never be the same again. From that day forward, she complained of unbearable pain in her chest. Doctors ran test after test, x-rays, blood work, heart monitoring, neurological exams. Everything came back normal. No infection, no trauma, no disease, and yet she was dying. Over the next several months, Estefanía's condition worsened. She suffered terrifying hallucinations. She claimed to see dark figures standing at the foot of her bed. She said something followed her, watched her, whispered her name when no one else was in the room. Her parents thought it was psychological. Doctors thought it was stress. Priests thought it was imagination. No one could agree, but no one could help her either. Then one night, Estefanía began screaming. Not crying, not sobbing, screaming. Her parents rushed into her room and found her clutching her chest, gasping, her face twisted in terror. She screamed that something was inside her, crushing her from within. Moments later, she went into cardiac arrest. She was rushed to the hospital, and she died. The official cause of death: sudden cardiac failure. But there was a problem. The autopsy revealed something impossible. Her heart showed no physical damage, no blockage, no defect, no disease. Doctors could not explain why a healthy 14-year-old girl's heart simply stopped. The case was closed. or so everyone thought. 1 month later, the family moved. They had to. The apartment on Luis Marin Street felt wrong after Estefania's death. The silence was too heavy, the air too cold. The rooms felt occupied even when empty. They thought a change of environment would help them grieve. They were wrong. It began subtly. A framed photograph of Estefania fell from the wall, not shattered, not knocked crooked, but placed face down on the floor. The television turned on by itself in the middle of the night, blasting static. Lights flickered. Doors creaked open when locked. At first, the family blamed grief, stress, electrical issues. But then the noises changed. Scratching sounds came from inside the walls. Deep, slow scraping, like fingernails dragging through plaster. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway at night, far too heavy to belong to any member of the family. The younger siblings began waking up with scratches and bruises on their bodies, marks that hadn't been there when they went to sleep. They began to hear voices, a girl's voice, calling their names. The mother, Maria, was the first to say it out loud. She believed it was Estefania, not her daughter, but something using her voice. One night, the family heard a loud crash in the living room. When they rushed in, they found the cabinet torn open. Inside was a photograph of Estefania, ripped apart, the eyes scratched out. No one had touched it. The doors had been locked, the windows closed. The fear became unbearable. On November 27th, 1992, with no other option left, the family called the police. This decision would change everything, because what happened next would be officially documented by law enforcement and would become one of the few paranormal cases in history supported by a police report. 2 officers arrived at the apartment. They expected hysteria. They expected exaggeration. They expected a grieving family imagining things. What they did not expect was to experience it themselves. As the officers walked through the apartment, they heard a loud bang come from one of the bedrooms. A wardrobe door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. One officer reported feeling a sudden pressure in his chest, as if the air had thickened. Then the growling started, low, guttural, not human. The officers later stated that objects began moving on their own. A crucifix lifted from the wall and flew across the room, shattering on impact. A photograph burst into flames without any visible source of ignition. The temperature dropped suddenly. And then, silence. Shaken, the officers did something almost unheard of. They wrote everything down, not as speculation, not as belief, but as observation. Their official report concluded with a sentence that would echo through Spanish paranormal history. The phenomena observed cannot be explained by logical or physical causes. From that moment on, the Vallecas case was no longer just a ghost story. It was a documented mystery, and whatever had entered that classroom months earlier had followed Estefanía home. After the police left the apartment on Luis Marin Street that night, something irreversible happened. The Vallecas case crossed the line. Until then, it had been a private nightmare. A grieving family, strange occurrences, whispers of something supernatural that most outsiders could dismiss as stress or imagination. But once law enforcement officers documented unexplained phenomena, the story stopped belonging to the family alone. It entered the system, and the system didn't know what to do with it. The officers who responded that night did not sleep well afterward. One of them later admitted, unofficially, that he had handled violent criminals, fatal accidents, and death scenes. But nothing had unsettled him like that apartment. The fear wasn't explosive. It wasn't immediate panic. It was slow, invasive, the kind that settles in the chest and doesn't leave. Their report was filed exactly as procedure demanded. It included times, locations, descriptions of events, and the officer's personal observations. There was no mention of ghosts, demons, or spirits. Only facts. Objects moved without explanation. Sounds originated from empty rooms. A crucifix detached and flew through the air. A photograph ignited without a heat source. Nothing in police training covered this. Word spread quickly, not through the media at first, but through unofficial channels, whispers among officers, discussions behind desks, quiet jokes meant to hide discomfort. Some laughed it off, others didn't. A few refused to enter the apartment again. But the disturbances did not stop. They intensified. The family's daily life became impossible. Every room felt hostile. At night, the children refused to sleep alone. The younger siblings described seeing a shadow standing in the hallway, tall, motionless, watching. They said it had no face, just darkness where eyes should be. One of the children claimed the shadow spoke, not aloud, inside his head. Physical manifestations escalated. Furniture shifted positions overnight. Doors slammed with enough force to crack the frames. Loud banging echoed from inside walls that inspectors confirmed were hollow and empty. Electrical appliances malfunctioned constantly. Televisions turned on by themselves. Radios emitted static even when unplugged. Light bulbs exploded without overheating. And always, there was the sensation of being watched. Medical professionals were consulted again. Psychologists evaluated the family members individually. Stress, trauma, shared delusions. These were the working theories, but something didn't add up. The psychological profiles didn't match mass hysteria. The children's accounts were consistent even when separated. Their descriptions aligned in ways too precise to be coincidence. And then there were the physical injuries, scratches, bruises, finger-shaped marks on arms and legs. No one could explain how they appeared. At this point, investigators from outside the local police precinct began to take interest. Not paranormal investigators, but journalists, psychologists, and researchers curious about a case where official documentation contradicted rational explanations. Among them was Iker Jimenez, who would later become one of Spain's most well-known investigative journalists in unexplained phenomena. At the time, he was still early in his career, but the Vallecas case stood out immediately. It wasn't sensational, it was bureaucratic, and that made it terrifying. Jimenez and others reviewed the police report carefully. The language was cautious, restrained, and unmistakably professional. No exaggeration, no emotional commentary, just observation. That's what made it powerful. Police officers are trained observers. They are taught to describe scenes accurately, to avoid speculation, to rely on physical evidence. For officers to state in writing that something had no logical or physical explanation was almost unheard of. It suggested one of two things. Either the officers were lying, which would risk their careers, or they witnessed something real. Attempts were made to recreate the phenomena. Engineers examined the building. Electrical systems were inspected for faults. Gas lines were checked. Structural integrity was evaluated. No irregularities were found, no vibrations, no pressure anomalies, no sources of ignition. The apartment behaved normally when unoccupied. The disturbances occurred only when the family was present. The most unsettling aspect was the targeting. Objects did not fall randomly. They moved toward people. Sounds originated near individuals, not walls. The phenomena responded to human presence. Sometimes immediately after someone spoke Estefania's name, That detail haunted investigators because if true, it suggested intent. Religious authorities were contacted, reluctantly. The Catholic Church approached the situation carefully. Spain was still deeply religious, but the Church had learned to be cautious after centuries of accusations, hoaxes, and misinterpretations. Priests who visited the apartment conducted blessings, prayers, and rites, but nothing changed. In some cases, the activity worsened. One priest reportedly refused to return. Skeptics proposed fraud, but fraud requires planning, coordination, and motive. The family gained nothing from the attention. In fact, their lives were being destroyed by it. They faced ridicule, isolation, and suspicion. Neighbors avoided them. Friends stopped visiting. No money was made. No fame sought. No advantage gained. Only fear. The case took a darker turn when audio recordings were introduced. During one visit, a recording device was left running in an empty room. The intention was simple: to document ambient noise. When the tape was later reviewed, investigators heard unexplained sounds, whispers, breathing, and something resembling a low, distorted voice. No one present could identify the source. At this stage, the Vallecas case had become a collision point between disciplines. Psychology said trauma. Engineering said nothing was wrong. Religion said prayer failed. Police said the phenomena occurred. Science had no answer. Perhaps the most chilling detail was the consistency of one element: Estefanía. Her name surfaced repeatedly. Objects associated with her were targeted. Her photographs were destroyed. Her voice was reported by multiple witnesses. This raised a horrifying possibility. Not that something random had entered the apartment, but that something had attached itself to a person. If that were true, then the origin mattered. The Ouija session at school could no longer be dismissed as teenage curiosity gone wrong. It became the focal point, the moment when something may have been invited, intentionally or not. And if something had been invited, then it had followed rules unknown to science. By the early 1990s, the Vallecas case was quietly becoming one of the most disturbing documented mysteries in Spain. Not because it was loud or spectacular, but because every attempt to explain it failed. No evidence of hoax, no psychological collapse, no environmental cause, only a trail of reports, witnesses, and unanswered questions. Segment 2 ends not with resolution, but with escalation. Because what happens next will force investigators to confront the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the phenomenon was neither supernatural nor psychological, but something science simply didn't yet understand? By the time the Vallecas case reached its third phase, something strange had happened. The phenomena had not diminished. The witnesses had not contradicted themselves. The police report still stood uncontested, and yet the system began to retreat. At first, interest from professionals increased. Psychologists, neurologists, engineers, and independent researchers requested access to the case. Some were curious, others were skeptical. A few were openly hostile toward the idea that something unexplained had occurred. They all shared one assumption: there had to be a rational explanation, but Vallecas refused to provide one. Psychologists revisited the family, this time with more aggressive scrutiny. They looked for signs of suggestion, reinforcement, and shared trauma. Interviews were conducted separately. Statements were cross-checked. Reactions were monitored for inconsistency. The results were uncomfortable. The family members showed no signs of collective delusion. Their emotional responses varied naturally. The children described events in age-appropriate ways, without embellishment. Their accounts remained consistent even months apart. Most troubling of all, Some events occurred when the family was not together, eliminating the possibility of mutual reinforcement. Neurologists explored whether Estefania's death could have been linked to an undiagnosed condition: epilepsy, cardiac arrhythmia, brain inflammation. Old medical records were reviewed again. Nothing emerged. Her death remained medically unexplained. This mattered because skeptics argued that if Estefania's illness had been psychological, then the haunting could be a projection of unresolved grief. But without a psychological or medical explanation for her death, that argument weakened. The foundation was missing. Engineers returned to the apartment. They brought equipment this time: sensors, meters, recording devices. They measured electromagnetic fields, vibrations, temperature gradients, air pressure, electrical fluctuations. Everything behaved normally, until it didn't. On multiple occasions, sudden spikes were recorded, brief, localized anomalies that disappeared before they could be traced to a source. Too short to be equipment failure, too isolated to be environmental. No explanation followed. The readings did not prove anything supernatural, but they contradicted the idea that nothing unusual was happening. The problem was not that science failed. The problem was that science could not agree. Every discipline found something off, but no discipline could claim authority over the explanation. Each expert deferred responsibility to another field. Psychologists blamed neurology. Engineers blamed human perception. Neurologists blamed stress. And so, the case stalled. At the same time, media exposure increased. Local newspapers reported cautiously. National outlets sensationalized. Headlines blurred facts and speculation. The family became reluctant participants in a story they could no longer control. This had consequences. As attention grew, official involvement decreased. Authorities do not like uncertainty in public view. Unsolved mysteries undermine confidence. And this case, with police documentation, no resolution, and no clear boundary between rational and irrational, was becoming dangerous. Not because it threatened lives, but because it threatened credibility. Quietly, involvement from official institutions slowed. No new task force, no formal investigation, no long-term monitoring. The case wasn't closed, it was abandoned. This is where Vallecas becomes deeply unsettling. Not because of what happened in the apartment, but because of what didn't happen afterward. No definitive debunking, no official explanation, no correction of the police report. The system chose silence. Researchers who attempted to continue independently encountered resistance. Access to documents became difficult. Interviews were discouraged. Requests for follow-ups were ignored or delayed indefinitely. No one said, "Stop," but everything said it anyway. One explanation emerged quietly among professionals. The case had crossed into a grey zone that institutions were not equipped to handle. It was not provably paranormal. It was not provably psychological. It was not provably fraudulent. And that made it dangerous, because unresolved anomalies invite questions. During this time, an unsettling pattern was noticed by those still paying attention. The phenomena had not spread. It had not followed investigators. It had not escalated into public spaces. It remained contained to the family, contained to Estefanía, contained to that apartment. This suggested something crucial. If the events were psychological, they should have diminished with time, therapy, and distance. If they were environmental, they should have affected others. If they were fraudulent, inconsistencies should have emerged. None of that happened. Instead, the case simply aged. Years passed. The disturbances reportedly faded, not with resolution, but with exhaustion. The family learned to live around them. The phenomena became sporadic, unpredictable, and eventually less violent. Not gone, just quiet. As if whatever had been present no longer needed attention. This raised one final scientific question that no one wanted to ask publicly. What if the phenomenon had completed its purpose? That idea was never written into reports, but it lingered. Modern researchers who later reviewed the Vallecas case noticed something disturbing. Every attempt to force an explanation failed, but every attempt to observe without interference produced documentation. The moment people tried to categorize it, the case collapsed. The moment people simply recorded it, the case remained coherent. This is where Vallecas stops behaving like a haunting story and starts behaving like an anomaly. Something that does not seek belief, only presence. By the end of this phase, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The Vallecas case was not unresolved because of lack of evidence. It was unresolved because no existing framework could contain it. Science did not disprove it. Religion did not resolve it. Authority did not deny it. They all stepped back. Segment 3 ends here. Not with answers, but with institutional retreat. Because what follows next is even more unsettling. What happens when a case becomes too real to explain and too documented to dismiss? By the time the Vallecas case reached its 4th year, the most disturbing change was not what was happening inside the apartment. It was what was happening outside it. Nothing. No new visits. No new interviews. No new statements from authorities. The police report still existed. It had never been retracted, corrected, or amended, but it was no longer referenced. Requests to revisit the case were redirected, delayed, or quietly dismissed. The file remained technically open, yet functionally abandoned. This kind of silence was unusual. In unresolved cases, especially those involving public fear, institutions typically choose one of two paths: escalation or debunking. They either invest more resources or publicly discredit the claims to restore confidence. Vallecas received neither. Behind closed doors, the reason was simple. No department wanted ownership of the case. The police could not explain it. Medical professionals could not contradict the autopsy. Psychologists could not establish a diagnosis. Engineers could not identify a mechanical cause. Every attempt to reassign responsibility failed, and so responsibility dissolved. Years later, journalists who attempted to obtain updates encountered an odd pattern. Officials did not deny the events. They did not ridicule the family. They did not label the case fraudulent. They simply refused to elaborate. When asked about the police report, responses were vague. When asked whether further investigation had occurred, answers were procedural. The case was always described as inactive, never false. That distinction mattered. In the absence of official movement, independent researchers revisited the available evidence. They noticed something unsettling. The Vallecas case did not deteriorate under scrutiny. It did not grow weaker with time. In fact, it grew more coherent. Statements made years apart still aligned. Details that should have been forgotten remained consistent. Physical descriptions of events did not mutate into exaggeration. The narrative did not evolve. This contradicted what psychologists expect in cases of false memory or shared trauma. Usually, stories drift, details inflate, memories blend. Vallecas did not behave that way. Another contradiction emerged. If the case were purely psychological, the phenomena should have ceased once attention faded and therapy progressed. Yet reports suggested the disturbances continued intermittently for years. though less violently. If the case were environmental, new occupants should have experienced similar effects. They did not. If the case were fraudulent, the family should have benefited. They didn't. They withdrew from media. They refused interviews. They avoided public attention entirely. Every traditional explanation failed one test or another. Later, forensic psychologists proposed a more complex model: triggered psychophysical response, where trauma manifests physically and collectively under specific environmental cues. It was an elegant theory, and it failed because it could not explain external witnesses, or moving objects, or ignition without heat, or synchronized experiences. It explained emotion, not interaction. Another group explored electromagnetic interference, suggesting that fluctuating fields might affect perception, induce fear, or even cause hallucinations. Again, reasonable. Again, insufficient. Measured fields in the apartment did not remain elevated. Equipment recorded anomalies, but not consistently enough to explain the scale of events. And electromagnetic theories did not explain intent. Objects moving toward people, not randomly. This left a narrow and uncomfortable space. Not supernatural, because science does not confirm that category. Not psychological, because evidence contradicted it. Not fraudulent, because motive was absent. Something else. At this point, Vallecas stopped being discussed in absolutes and began to be discussed in probabilities. Not what was it, but what could it have been? And the answers grew darker. One theory proposed that Estefania's death acted as a catalyst, not spiritually, but neurologically and emotionally, imprinting a trauma pattern so intense that it altered perception, behavior, and stress responses in measurable ways. But again, this required events that occurred in empty rooms, witnessed by outsiders, and recorded by equipment to be illusions. The math did not work. Another theory suggested unintentional induction, that the Ouija session had acted as a psychological trigger, powerful enough to fracture normal cognitive boundaries. But this still failed to explain why trained police officers experienced and documented phenomena independently. The most controversial theory avoided labels entirely. It suggested Vallecas was not a haunting, possession, or delusion, but a rare anomaly of human perception interacting with unknown environmental variables. Not a ghost, not a demon, but something real that science had not yet named. This theory was never published officially. It circulated quietly. And then there was the theory no institution would touch. The idea that the phenomena had agency. Not consciousness in a human sense, but responsiveness, reaction, presence. That something responded to names, proximity, emotion. That it wasn't random. That it wasn't passive. This theory had no place in reports, but it refused to disappear. Years later, when the family was interviewed privately, they said something chilling. They said the activity did not end with force or prayer. It ended with time, as if whatever had been present lost interest or completed something. That detail haunted investigators who revisited the case decades later, because in nature, in psychology, in physics, things don't simply stop without cause. Processes decay, energy dissipates, trauma resolves or worsens. But Vallecas did neither. It faded. The case remains one of the few in Europe where law enforcement documentation directly contradicts rational closure, and yet remains uncontested. No retraction, no correction, no explanation. Just a report, still valid, still unresolved. By the end of segment 4, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Vallecas case did not survive because it was mysterious. It survived because nothing ever disproved it. And in science, that absence is not neutral. It is dangerous. What comes next is the most unsettling part of all, because the final question is no longer what happened. It is this: what if Vallecas wasn't an isolated case, but a glimpse of something that usually goes unnoticed? By the time the Vallecas case faded from official attention, something irreversible had already occurred. Not in the apartment, not in the family, but in the boundary between explanation and uncertainty. Because Vallecas did not behave like a hoax that collapses under pressure, nor like a legend that grows with retelling. It behaved like a system that resisted classification, stable, contained, and indifferent to belief, and that made it dangerous. Years later, when researchers revisited the case with distance and restraint, they noticed something no one had articulated clearly before. Vallecas did not ask to be believed. There were no grand manifestations meant to impress, no public spectacles, no escalation timed to media attention. The events occurred privately, quietly, often without witnesses, except when witnesses were unavoidable. This is the opposite of how fraud behaves. Fraud seeks exposure. Anomalies do not. One of the most disturbing realizations came from comparing Vallecas to other documented cases. Most alleged paranormal incidents follow emotional spikes: grief, stress, conflict. Vallecas did not. Its timeline was strangely disciplined. Events occurred regardless of emotional state. Calm nights produced activity. Chaos sometimes produced none. There was no emotional correlation. That absence mattered. Modern psychologists reviewing the transcripts pointed out something else. The family's descriptions lacked symbolism. People experiencing hallucinations or delusions tend to describe events using metaphor. Demons, monsters, religious imagery. The Vallecas family didn't. They described movement, sound, pressure, temperature, mechanical descriptions, as if they were reporting equipment malfunction, not terror. This stripped the case of mythology, which made it worse. Another late analysis focused on the police officers themselves. Their report did not contain uncertainty language. There was no possibly, seemed, or appeared to. They described events as observed facts, then stated they could not explain them. This is a crucial distinction. They did not claim supernatural causes. They claimed explanatory failure. That report has never been revoked. In institutional systems, unresolved documentation is a liability, which raises a chilling question. Why was it allowed to stand? Some believe the answer lies in classification. Vallecas did not fit crime, illness, or fraud. It was not violent enough to demand intervention, nor trivial enough to dismiss. It sat in a category that has no department, and what cannot be categorized cannot be resolved. So it was left alone. As decades passed, speculative theories grew more disciplined, not more imaginative. Physicists proposed rare interactions between consciousness and environmental systems, where intense neurological stress might alter perception fields. Neuroscientists explored whether grief could synchronize perception across individuals in ways not yet measured. These theories were cautious, but none could explain external witnesses, or physical displacement, or recorded anomalies. The most unsettling theory avoided all existing frameworks. It suggested that Vallecas was not paranormal, but pre-paranormal, that what occurred was real, measurable, and physical, but belongs to a class of phenomena humanity has not yet identified, much like radiation once existed before it was named. This theory carries a terrifying implication, that similar events may occur elsewhere, unnoticed, undocumented, and quietly forgotten. Under this lens, the Ouija board becomes irrelevant, not a portal, not a ritual, just a trigger, A moment that focused attention, emotion, and cognition in a way that destabilized something already present, not summoned, disturbed. This reframes Estefania's death in a deeply uncomfortable way, not as possession, not as coincidence, but as a medical failure, a system encountering something it did not understand and could not measure. Her heart did not fail because it was damaged. It failed because something overwhelmed it, and no instrument recorded it. Perhaps the most chilling detail emerged much later, during a private interview with one of the children. Now an adult, they were asked if they ever felt the presence after leaving the apartment. The answer was no, not fear, not relief, just absence, as if the phenomenon had never followed, never attached, never lingered. It belonged to that place, to that time, to that configuration. That detail undermines haunting narratives entirely. Hauntings follow people. Vallecas did not. It stayed. Today, the apartment exists like any other. New occupants reported nothing unusual. No disturbances, no sounds, no shadows. Skeptics cite this as proof the case was psychological. But that assumes phenomena behave like trauma. What if they behave like systems? Systems activate under conditions, then stop. The Vallecas case remains unique not because it proves the paranormal, but because it resists dismissal without asserting belief. It does not ask you to accept ghosts. It asks you to confront ignorance. The most honest conclusion investigators have reached is also the most disturbing. Something happened. It was documented. It was witnessed, and it was never explained. Not because it was hidden, but because no one knew where to put it. In that sense, Vallecas represents a rare failure state, a moment where science, psychology, authority, and belief all reached their limits and stopped. And that silence is not comforting. It suggests there are experiences humanity can encounter before it is ready to understand them. The case remains officially unresolved, not contested, not corrected, not closed, just there, waiting.